We don't serve your kind here. The words hit Salai Hill like a physical blow, even though she'd heard them whispered in her mind the moment they walked through the oak doors of Magnolia Grove restaurant. Her husband Harpo's hand tightened around hers, and she felt their 7-year-old daughter Dorothy's small fingers slip into her other palm. "Excuse me." Harpo's voice carried the controlled tension of a man who'd spent 34 years learning when to fight and when to walk away. The hostess, a blonde woman whose name tag read Ashley, didn't even blink. Her manicured fingers drummed against the reservation podium as she repeated herself with the casual cruelty of someone discussing the weather. "I said we don't serve your kind here. This is a family establishment." Salai's throat constricted. They were a family. They were dressed in their Sunday best, Harpo in his navy suit, herself in the emerald dress she'd saved 3 months to buy, and Dorothy in her favorite yellow sundress with the butterfly buttons. They'd driven 40 minutes from downtown specifically for this restaurant after reading about its historic charm and warm southern hospitality online. The dining room stretched behind Ashley like a museum exhibit of genteel wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in white linen, where other families, all white families, continued their conversations in hushed tones. Some pretended not to notice the confrontation unfolding at the entrance. Others watched with undisguised curiosity. "Look, we don't want any trouble," Harpo said, his voice steady but strained. "We made a reservation. Hill, party of 3, 7:30. Ashley's smile never wavered, but her eyes went cold. "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake. We don't have any reservations under that name." Salai pulled out her phone, fingers trembling as she scrolled to the confirmation email. "Right here. Confirmation number. I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. You're disturbing our other guests." The injustice of it struck Salai speechless. She wasn't raising her voice. She was barely speaking above a whisper. But she could feel the weight of every stare in the restaurant, could sense the way conversations had shifted from genuine dinner discussion to hushed commentary about the situation at the front. "Hey, my friend, hope you're doing well. Drop a comment and let me know how you're feeling about this story so far and where you are watching from. Some stories are too close to my heart to share on YouTube. I send those, along with little life lessons and surprises, to my email circle. If you'd like to be part of it, you can join with the link in the description." Dorothy tugged on Salai's dress. "Memau, why is that lady being mean to us?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Ashley's perfect hostess mask flickered for just a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the establishments downtown. I could recommend." "No need," Harpo interrupted, placing his hand on Salai's back. "We'll find somewhere that actually wants our business." As they turned to leave, Dorothy suddenly stopped. Her small body went rigid, and she pointed toward the far wall of the restaurant where a collection of framed photographs hung like a gallery of local history. "Mom," Dorothy said, her voice cutting through the awkward silence with the clarity that only children possess. "Why is Grandma Ilsa on that picture?" The words hit the restaurant like a thunderclap. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Even Ashley's practiced composure cracked as she followed Dorothy's pointing finger to a large, prominently displayed portrait of a dignified black woman in 1960s attire, standing proudly in front of the very building they now occupied. Salai's world tilted. The woman in the photograph wore the same determined expression Salai remembered from childhood stories, the same gentle smile that had welcomed countless civil rights workers to strategy meetings in her kitchen. The brass nameplate beneath the frame read, "Ilsa Burke, founder, 1962 to 1989. "That's..." Salai's voice failed her. Harpo moved closer to the wall, his face a mask of disbelief and growing anger. "That's your grandmother, Salai. That's Grandma Ilsa." The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Ashley's face had drained of color, and she kept glancing between the portrait and the family as if trying to solve an impossible equation. Dorothy, oblivious to the tension crackling around her, walked right up to the photograph with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "She looks different here, but that's definitely Grandma. See her necklace? The one with the little bird. She used to let me wear it when we played dress-up." Salai's knees nearly buckled. She remembered that necklace. A small golden dove that her grandmother had worn every day until the cancer took her 3 years ago. The same necklace that now sat in a jewelry box on Salai's dresser, waiting for Dorothy to grow old enough to inherit it. "There must be some mistake," Ashley stammered, but her voice lacked conviction now. "No mistake," said a new voice from across the restaurant. An elderly white man in an expensive suit had risen from his table, his face grave. "I knew Ilsa Burke personally. Finest woman who ever lived in this county." He looked directly at Ashley. "And if this child says that's her great-grandmother, then you've just tried to refuse service to the family of the woman who built this place." The weight of realization settled over the restaurant like fog. Murmurs started at individual tables and spread outward as diners began connecting the dots. Some pulled out phones, others simply stared in fascination and horror at the unfolding drama. Ashley's hands shook as she reached for something behind the podium, probably a phone to call her manager. But it was too late for damage control. The story was already writing itself in real time, with Dorothy's innocent observation as the catalyst that would force everyone in that room to confront a truth that had been hanging on the wall all along. Salai stared at her grandmother's portrait, feeling the woman's painted eyes looking back at her with that familiar mixture of love and fierce determination. Suddenly, walking away felt like the greatest betrayal she could commit against the woman who had fought her entire life to ensure her granddaughter would never have to face moments like this. "We're not leaving," Salai heard herself say, surprised by the steel in her own voice. The real story was just beginning. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Salai stood frozen in the restaurant's entrance, her grandmother's painted eyes seeming to watch from the wall, waiting for her granddaughter to either honor her legacy or abandon it at the first sign of resistance. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," Ashley whispered, her hostess' smile now completely abandoned. Sweat beaded along her hairline despite the restaurant's air conditioning. "No." Salai's voice carried a strength she didn't know she possessed. "My grandmother didn't build this place so her family could be shuffled into back rooms and quiet conversations." The elderly man who had spoken earlier approached their group, moving with the careful dignity of someone accustomed to being heard. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his suit probably cost more than Salai made in a month, but his eyes held genuine warmth. "Mrs. Hill, I presume." He extended his hand. "I'm Judge Walter Blackwood, retired. I had the privilege of knowing your grandmother for over 20 years. Salai shook his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of a man who'd worked with his hands before he worked with law books. "You knew Grandma Ilsa." "Knew her." Judge Blackwood's laugh held both affection and sadness. "She saved my life more than once. When I was just a young public defender taking on cases nobody else wanted, Ilsa would make sure I had a hot meal and a safe place to plan strategy. This restaurant, well, it wasn't called Magnolia Grove back then." Dorothy, still standing near the portrait, looked back at the adults with that peculiar intensity children have when they sense important things happening beyond their understanding. "What was it called?" "Burke's Kitchen," the judge said gently. "Named after your great-grandmother. She opened it in 1962, right in the middle of some of the ugliest times this county ever saw." Salai felt tears threatening. She'd heard fragments of these stories throughout her childhood. Grandma Ilsa speaking in careful, measured tones about the old days and the work that needed doing. But her grandmother had always been more focused on the future than the past, more interested in Salai's homework than in dwelling on historical injustices. "I don't understand," Harpo said, his protective instincts still on high alert. "If Mrs. Burke owned this place, how did it become?" He gestured around the restaurant, and Salai understood what he couldn't bring himself to say. How did a place built by a black civil rights activist become somewhere that refused to serve black families? Judge Blackwood's expression darkened. "That, I'm afraid, is a more complicated story. One that involves some very powerful people who would prefer it remain buried." Ashley had been whispering urgently into her phone, and now she approached the group with visible nervousness. "I've called Mr. Patterson. He's the owner. He'll be here in 15 minutes. "Timothy Patterson." Judge Blackwood's eyebrows rose. Well, this should be interesting. The name meant nothing to Salai, but she could see it meant something significant to the judge. Before she could ask, a new voice joined the conversation. "Excuse me, but did someone say Burke's Kitchen?" A black woman in her 50s had risen from a corner table, her expression a mixture of excitement and disbelief. She was elegantly dressed, with graying hair pulled back in a sophisticated bun and jewelry that suggested considerable success. Her dinner companion, a white man about the same age, watched with obvious concern as she approached. "I'm Dr. Violet Hawkins," the woman said, extending her hand to Salai. "I'm a historian at the university, and I've been researching civil rights movements in rural communities. Burke's Kitchen is legendary in academic circles, but I thought all records of it had been deliberately destroyed." "Destroyed?" Salai's stomach clenched. Dr. Hawkins nodded gravely. "In the 1980s, There was a systematic effort to erase the history of black-owned businesses in this county. Records disappeared from the courthouse, photographs vanished from newspaper archives, even family documents went missing from people's homes. That's impossible, Harpo protested. You can't just erase history. You'd be surprised how effectively history can be buried when powerful people have enough motivation, Dr. Hawkins replied. Your grandmother's restaurant was more than just a place to eat. It was headquarters for voter registration drives, a safe house for civil rights workers, and a symbol that black business owners could thrive despite systematic oppression. Dorothy had been listening with the rapt attention children reserve for stories that feel important, even when they don't fully understand them. So Grandma was famous. She was a hero, Judge Blackwood said simply. And some people found that very threatening. The front door chimed, and everyone turned to see a man in his late 50s stride into the restaurant with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Timothy Patterson was tall and lean, with silver temples and clothes that screamed expensive taste. His eyes swept the gathering at the entrance, taking in every detail with calculating precision. Ashley called about some kind of misunderstanding. His voice carried a slight southern drawl that might have been charming under different circumstances. Mr. Patterson, Judge Blackwood stepped forward. I don't believe you've met Salai Hill. She's Ilsa Burke's granddaughter. Patterson's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his eyes flicked to the portrait on the wall before returning to Salai with newfound wariness. Mrs. Hill, he said carefully. What a surprise. I understand there's been some confusion about seating arrangements. The confusion, Salai said, finding her voice again, is why a restaurant founded by my grandmother is refusing to serve her family. Patterson's smile was perfectly practiced, the kind refined by years of political fundraisers and Chamber of Commerce meetings. Mrs. Hill, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the history of this establishment. While we certainly honor all the previous owners of this property, Magnolia Grove has been family-owned and operated since 1995. That's interesting, Dr. Hawkins interjected, pulling out her phone. Because according to the property records I've been researching, Burke's Kitchen operated continuously until 1989, and the deed was never officially transferred. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Patterson's smile flickered like a candle in wind. Dr. Hawkins, isn't it? I'm familiar with your work at the university. Sometimes academic research can be incomplete, missing certain legal nuances. The only thing missing, Judge Blackwood said quietly, is an explanation of how a woman who never sold her property somehow lost ownership of it. Salai watched the exchange with growing unease. These people clearly knew things she didn't, had access to information that her family had somehow been denied. Her grandmother had never mentioned losing the restaurant, had never mentioned selling it or having it taken away. In fact, Grandma Ilsa had rarely talked about the restaurant at all, which now seemed suspiciously deliberate. Mr. Patterson, Salai said, stepping forward. I'd like to know exactly how you came to own a building that belonged to my family. Patterson's mask slipped just enough to reveal something cold underneath. Mrs. Hill, property ownership is a matter of public record. If you have questions about legal transfers of deed, I suggest you consult with an attorney. Or, Dr. Hawkins said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to challenging official narratives, you could simply tell us the truth about what happened to Ilsa Burke's restaurant. The standoff stretched between them, with Dorothy still standing innocently beside her great-grandmother's portrait, unaware that her simple observation had set in motion a confrontation that had been decades in the making. Patterson pulled out his phone, his movements sharp with irritation. Ashley, please prepare the Magnolia room for a private discussion. It seems we have some historical matters to clarify. As he spoke, Salai caught something in his tone, a satisfaction that made her skin crawl. The way he said historical matters sounded less like someone preparing to reveal truth and more like someone planning to bury it deeper. The first betrayal came not as a dramatic revelation, but as a creeping realization that they were being led exactly where Timothy Patterson wanted them to go. The Magnolia room sat behind the main dining area like a secret kept in plain sight. As Patterson led them through the restaurant, Salai noticed how other diners watched their procession with the hungry fascination people reserve for car accidents and courtroom drama. Dorothy held tight to her mother's hand, her earlier excitement replaced by the intuitive unease children feel when adults start speaking in careful, measured tones. The private dining room was smaller than Salai had expected, dominated by a mahogany table that could seat 12 and walls lined with more photographs, all featuring white families, white business owners, white community leaders stretching back decades. The only exception was a small, almost hidden frame in the corner that showed the restaurant's exterior sometime in the 1960s, with a modest sign reading Burke's Kitchen barely visible in the faded photograph. "Please, sit," Patterson said, his earlier hostility replaced by the calculated courtesy of a man who'd realized he needed to control the narrative. "Ashley, bring coffee for everyone. And perhaps some apple juice for the young lady." Dr. Hawkins remained standing, her historian's eye cataloging every detail of the room. "Interesting collection of photographs, Mr. Patterson. Very selective. We preserve the history that's relevant to our current clientele," Patterson replied smoothly. "Now, Mrs. Hill, I think we can resolve this misunderstanding quickly if we approach it rationally." Judge Blackwood settled into a chair with the deliberate movements of a man whose arthritis reminded him daily of his 78 years. "Timothy, I've known you since you were 16 years old and stealing kisses behind the courthouse. Don't insult our intelligence with corporate speak." Something flickered across Patterson's face, embarrassment, perhaps, or the discomfort of being reminded of a less polished version of himself. "Walter, this is a delicate situation. There are legal implications." "The only legal implication," Dr. Hawkins interrupted, "is that you're operating a business on property that was never legally transferred from its original owner." Salai felt her heart racing. "What does that mean, exactly?" Dr. Hawkins pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through documents. "I've been researching your grandmother's story for my book on civil rights entrepreneurs. Ilsa Burke never sold this property. According to every record I can find, she owned Burke's Kitchen until the day she died." The words hit Salai like a physical blow. Her grandmother had died 3 years ago in a small apartment downtown, struggling to pay medical bills despite a lifetime of hard work. The idea that she'd owned valuable property this entire time. "That's impossible," Harpo said. "Salai's grandmother would have told us. She would have left it to the family." Patterson's jaw tightened. "Gentlemen, ladies, I understand emotions are running high, but I've owned this property legally for 30 years. I have documentation." "Forged documentation," Judge Blackwood said quietly. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Patterson's face went white, then flushed red as every person in the room turned to stare at him. "Walter, that's a serious allegation." "It's a serious crime," the judge replied. "Which is why I kept my mouth shut for 3 decades, hoping you'd eventually develop a conscience and make things right." Salai's world was tilting again, but this time it felt like everything she'd believed about her family, her grandmother, and her own place in the world was shifting beneath her feet. "Judge Blackwood, what are you saying?" The elderly man looked directly at Patterson, his expression carrying the weight of years and secrets. "I'm saying that in 1989, Timothy Patterson was a young lawyer desperate to make his mark. His client was a development company that wanted to buy Burke's Kitchen, but Ilsa refused to sell. So they found alternative methods." "That's slander," Patterson said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Dr. Hawkins had found something on her tablet that made her eyes widen. "Because I'm looking at a death certificate that shows Ilsa Burke died in 1989. "She died 3 years ago," Salai protested. "I was at her funeral. I held her hand in the hospital." "No," Dr. Hawkins said gently. "According to the official records filed with the county, Ilsa Burke died on March 15, 1989, with no living heirs." The room went dead silent except for the distant sounds of normal dinner conversation filtering in from the main restaurant. Dorothy, who had been quietly coloring on a children's menu Ashley had provided, looked up with the piercing directness that children possess. "But Grandma didn't die until I was 4, she said simply. "I remember her birthday cake. It had purple flowers." Patterson stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is ridiculous. A child's memories, decades-old gossip, academic speculation, none of this constitutes legal evidence." "Actually," Judge Blackwood said, rising with the careful dignity of age, "it constitutes fraud. Criminal fraud, civil fraud, and probably conspiracy." He looked directly at Patterson. "The question is whether you acted alone or had help from people in the courthouse." Salai felt like she was drowning in implications she couldn't fully grasp. "Someone faked my grandmother's death certificate." "More than that," Dr. Hawkins said, her academic excitement warring with obvious sympathy for Salai's distress. "They created an entirely false legal history. Your grandmother was erased from official records, her property was declared abandoned, and then it was sold to Mr. Patterson's development company for taxes owed. Taxes on a business that was generating profit, Judge Blackwood added. Convenient, wouldn't you say? Patterson's composure was cracking now, his practiced politician's mask slipping to reveal something desperate underneath. You have no proof. Accusations aren't evidence. We have something better than proof, Salai said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. We have Dorothy. Everyone turned to look at the 7-year-old, who was still calmly coloring but clearly listening to every word. Sweetie, Salai said gently, tell these people about Grandma Ilsa. Tell them about the stories she used to tell you. Dorothy looked up with the serious expression children wear when they know adults are hanging on their words. Grandma used to tell me about her restaurant. She said it was the most beautiful place in the world, where everyone was welcome and the food made people happy. She said someday, when I was grown up, she'd show me where it used to be. Used to be. Patterson seized on the words. Past tense. The child just confirmed that the restaurant was closed. She said used to be. Dorothy continued with the ruthless honesty of childhood, because bad men took it away from her. She said they made papers that weren't true and told everyone she was dead when she wasn't. She looked directly at Patterson with the unblinking stare that children use when they've identified the source of adult distress. Are you one of the bad men? The question landed like a bomb in the elegant private dining room. Patterson's face went through several expressions, anger, panic, calculation, before settling on something that looked almost like resignation. Mrs. Hill, he said finally, perhaps we should discuss compensation for any historical inconveniences your family may have experienced. Compensation. Salai stood up so fast her chair nearly toppled. You stole my grandmother's life work and you want to offer compensation. I want to resolve this quietly, Patterson said. For everyone's sake. Your grandmother built something beautiful here, but that was a long time ago. I've invested millions in renovations, built a successful business, employed dozens of people. Surely we can find a solution that honors the past while protecting the present. The offer hung between them like a bridge Salai could either cross or burn. She could take whatever money Patterson offered, walk away, and return to her quiet life downtown. She could protect Dorothy from the ugliness of legal battles and public scrutiny. She could choose peace over justice. Or she could honor the woman whose portrait watched from the wall, the grandmother who had fought her entire life for the right to exist in spaces that tried to exclude her. Judge Blackwood, Salai said quietly, what would happen if I decided to fight this? Legally, I mean. The elderly man's smile was slow and satisfied. That would depend on how far you're willing to go. Because exposing what happened to your grandmother means exposing a conspiracy that goes much deeper than one stolen restaurant. How deep? Deep enough to implicate half the power structure in this county. Deep enough to uncover decades of fraudulent property transfers, tax evasion, and civil rights violations that people thought were safely buried. Patterson's face had gone pale. Walter, be very careful about the accusations you're making. I'm not making accusations, Judge Blackwood replied. I'm offering Mrs. Hill the truth. All of it. Salai looked at her daughter, still innocently coloring at the big mahogany table, and at her husband, whose expression told her he would support whatever decision she made. She thought about her grandmother's stories, carefully edited over the years to protect a child from the worst of history's ugliness. She thought about the portrait hanging in the main dining room, the dignified woman who had refused to be invisible. Dr. Hawkins, she said finally, how would you like exclusive access to a primary source for your book? Salai, Harpo said quietly, are you sure about this? She wasn't sure about anything except that walking away would mean her daughter would grow up in a world where people like Patterson could steal with impunity, secure in the knowledge that their victims would choose peace over justice. Mr. Patterson, she said, turning to face him directly, you're right about one thing. This is about more than dinner reservations. It's about whether my grandmother's legacy dies with her or lives on through her family. Mrs. Hill, I strongly advise you to reconsider. I've considered, Salai interrupted. And I've decided. We're not taking your money, and we're not walking away quietly. We're going to court. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, but it also felt like the first truly honest thing she'd done since walking into the restaurant. Patterson's expression shifted from desperation to something much colder, the look of a man who'd spent 30 years burying secrets and had no intention of letting them surface now. In that case, he said quietly, I think you should know that pursuing this matter will require extensive legal resources. Time away from work, court appearances, public scrutiny. And of course, there's no guarantee of success. Property law can be complicated. The threat was delivered with perfect politeness, but it was unmistakably a threat. Salai felt her resolve waver for just a moment as she considered what she was asking of her family. Then Dorothy looked up from her coloring and smiled, the same fearless smile that looked back at them from her great-grandmother's portrait. "Can we see the kitchen where Grandma used to cook?" she asked. "I want to see where she made all those meals for people." Patterson's mask slipped completely. For just a moment, he looked genuinely afraid. The point of no return wasn't a dramatic declaration or a moment of revelation. It was a 7-year-old girl asking to see her great-grandmother's kitchen, and her mother deciding that some questions deserved answers, no matter the cost. The kitchen of Burke's Kitchen, now Magnolia Grove, still bore traces of Ilsa Burke's original design beneath 30 years of upscale renovations. As Patterson reluctantly led them through the swinging doors, Salai could see where modern stainless steel appliances had been installed over older foundations, where new tile covered original flooring, where fresh paint couldn't quite hide the ghost marks of different layouts. Dorothy pressed close to her mother's side, her small hand slipping into Salai's as they entered the space where her great-grandmother had once created magic from simple ingredients and fierce determination. "She had a special station right here," Judge Blackwood said, pointing to a corner near the main prep area. "Ilsa would roll out biscuits every morning at 5 a.m., singing gospel songs loud enough to wake half the county." Dr. Hawkins moved through the kitchen with the methodical precision of an archaeologist, noting details and snapping photographs with her phone. "The original layout is still visible if you know what to look for. Your grandmother designed this for efficiency and community. Multiple people could work together without getting in each other's way." Patterson watched their exploration with barely concealed agitation, constantly checking his phone and glancing toward the dining room where his regular customers were still eating, still paying for the illusion of Southern elegance built on stolen legacy. "Mrs. Hill," he said finally, "I think we've indulged this nostalgic tour long enough. My staff needs to prepare for the evening service." "Of course," Salai replied, but she wasn't ready to leave. Being in this space felt like standing in her grandmother's embrace. She could almost smell the cornbread and coffee, could almost hear the laughter and serious conversations that had once filled these walls. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Then another. Then several more in rapid succession. Harpo noticed her expression change. "What is it?" Salai stared at her screen in disbelief. "My supervisor at the bank. She says there are irregularities in my employment background check. She needs to see me first thing Monday morning." "What kind of irregularities?" Dr. Hawkins asked sharply. Another text arrived, this one from their landlord. "Late payment notice." Salai's voice cracked. "But we paid rent last week. I have the bank confirmation." Her phone rang, the caller ID showing their insurance company. Harpo's phone began buzzing simultaneously. Then Dr. Hawkins' phone chimed with what sounded like an urgent email notification. "What the hell is happening?" Harpo answered his call, his face growing darker with each word he heard. "No, there's been no change in our policy. No, we haven't missed any payments." "What do you mean our coverage is under review?" Patterson had stepped away to take his own call, but Salai could see the satisfaction in his posture even from across the kitchen. When he returned, his expression was carefully neutral. "I'm sorry to hear you're having difficulties," he said with perfectly calculated sympathy. Sometimes when people make accusations against respected community members, unintended consequences follow. People talk, you understand. Word spreads. Judge Blackwood's expression hardened. "Timothy, are you threatening this family?" "I'm stating facts," Patterson replied smoothly. "Mrs. Hill has chosen to pursue a very public legal challenge against a prominent local business. Naturally, people will be curious about her background, her stability, her credibility." The words were delivered with corporate politeness, but the message was crystal clear. "Fight us, and we'll destroy your life piece by piece." Salai's phone rang again. This time it was Dorothy's school. "Mrs. Hill, this is Principal Martinez at Dorothy's elementary school. I'm calling about some concerns that have been raised regarding Dorothy's family situation." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Salai gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles went white. "What concerns?" "Perhaps we should discuss this in person. Could you come in Monday morning? We need to review Dorothy's enrollment status." "Her enrollment status?" Salai's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "She's been enrolled there for 3 years. Her grades are excellent. What possible?" "Mrs. Hill, I understand you're upset, but we have to follow proper procedures when questions are raised about a child's living situation." The call ended, leaving Salai staring at her phone in stunned silence. Around her, the kitchen that had once represented her grandmother's triumph now felt like a trap closing in from all sides. "They can't do this," Harpo said, ending his own call with their mortgage company. "They can't just manufacture problems because we're asking questions." "Actually, they can," Dr. Hawkins said grimly, reading something on her tablet. "I just received notice that my research sabbatical is under university review. Apparently, there are questions about my academic integrity and proper research protocols." Patterson shrugged with elaborate innocence. "I'm sure these are all just unfortunate coincidences. Sometimes when people are under stress, they make mistakes, miss payments, forget deadlines, fail to follow proper procedures." "This is harassment," Judge Blackwood said flatly. "This is business," Patterson corrected. "Mrs. Hill has chosen to make serious allegations against me and my establishment. Naturally, I need to protect my interests by ensuring that those allegations come from credible sources." Salai felt like she was drowning in implications. Within 2 hours of deciding to fight, her job was threatened, her housing was in jeopardy, her daughter's school placement was questioned, and their insurance coverage was under review. The message was unmistakable. Patterson had resources they'd never even imagined, and he was willing to use them. "How?" she whispered. "How do you even have the power to?" "Mrs. Hill," Patterson interrupted gently, "I've been a respected member of this community for 30 years. I serve on the hospital board, the school board, the Economic Development Council. I've donated generously to local charities, supported political candidates, helped numerous families through difficult times." His smile never wavered. When someone makes unfounded accusations against a pillar of the community, naturally people want to understand who's making those accusations and why. The elegant brutality of it took Salai's breath away. He wasn't just threatening her family, he was dismantling their entire support system with surgical precision, using connections built over decades to systematically destroy their credibility and stability. Dorothy tugged on Salai's dress. "Mama, why does everyone keep calling? Are we in trouble?" The question hit harder than any of Patterson's veiled threats. Salai knelt down to her daughter's eye level, trying to find words that would explain adult cruelty without destroying childhood innocence. "No, baby. We're not in trouble. Some people just don't like it when families ask questions about things that happened a long time ago. But asking questions is how you learn things," Dorothy said with the unassailable logic of 7-year-old wisdom. "Teacher says curious people make the world better." "Your teacher is absolutely right," Dr. Hawkins said, kneeling beside them. "And some of the most important questions are the ones that make certain people very uncomfortable." Patterson's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and his expression shifted to something that looked almost like relief. "Mrs. Hill, I think you'll want to take this opportunity to reconsider your position. I've just been informed that the county prosecutor's office has some questions about your family's financial history." The words hit like a physical blow. "Our financial history. Tax records, specifically. Apparently, there are discrepancies in your grandmother's estate filing from 3 years ago. Questions about unreported assets and potential inheritance tax evasion." Harpo stepped protectively in front of his wife and daughter. "That's impossible. Salai's grandmother didn't have any assets. She died with barely enough money for funeral expenses." According to the official records, Patterson said with poisonous sympathy, "Ilsa Burke died in 1989 with substantial property holdings. If she was actually alive until 3 years ago, as you claim, then someone has been evading taxes on those holdings for decades. The penalties alone would be substantial." The trap was perfect in its cruelty. To prove that her grandmother had been alive, and therefore that the property theft was real, Salai would have to admit to decades of tax evasion that could financially destroy her family and potentially result in criminal charges. "You're insane," she breathed. "You're trying to frame us for crimes you committed." "I'm not trying to do anything," Patterson replied calmly. "I'm simply pointing out the legal realities of the situation you've chosen to pursue." Judge Blackwood had been silent during this exchange, but now he stepped forward with the quiet authority that had once commanded courtrooms. "Timothy, you've made a serious mistake." "Have I?" "You've assumed that Salai and her family are fighting this alone." Patterson's confidence flickered slightly. "Walter, I hope you're not planning to involve yourself in civil litigation at your age. Think of your legacy." "I am thinking of my legacy," the judge replied. "Which is why I'm prepared to testify about what I witnessed 30 years ago. About the falsified documents, the corrupted officials, and the systematic theft of property from black families throughout this county. You have no proof. I have 30 years of guilt and a very good memory, Judge Blackwood interrupted. And unlike you, I kept records. The revelation hit the kitchen like a thunderclap. Patterson's face went through several emotions before settling on something that looked genuinely dangerous. Walter, be very careful. Elderly people sometimes misremember things. Sometimes they have accidents. The threat was delivered so quietly that Dorothy, standing just a few feet away, continued examining the industrial ovens with innocent curiosity. But every adult in the room heard it clearly. Dr. Hawkins stepped closer to the judge. Mr. Patterson, are you threatening an elderly man? I'm suggesting that people should be careful about making accusations they can't prove. Patterson's mask was completely gone now, revealing something cold and desperate underneath. Especially when those accusations could destroy not just individuals, but entire families. Salai felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. Fight, and watch her family destroyed piece by piece. Surrender, and teach her daughter that justice was only for people with enough power to claim it. Her phone buzzed with yet another message, this one from a number she didn't recognize. The text was brief, "Stop digging or your daughter pays the price." The kitchen seemed to tilt around her. This wasn't just about harassment or financial pressure anymore. This was about Dorothy's safety. "Harpo," she whispered, showing him the message. Her husband's face went from confusion to fury in seconds. "You son of a..." "I didn't send any message," Patterson said quickly, but his eyes gave him away. He knew exactly what text she'd received, which meant he either sent it or knew who did. Dorothy, oblivious to the adult drama unfolding around her, had wandered to a corner of the kitchen where old cookbooks sat on a shelf. She pulled one down and opened it, her face lighting up with recognition. "Look, Mama. Grandma's recipes." She held up a handwritten cookbook, its pages yellowed with age and splattered with decades of use. The cover read Ilsa's Kitchen, feeding body and soul in her grandmother's familiar handwriting. "That's not possible," Dr. Hawkins breathed. "All of your grandmother's personal effects were supposedly destroyed when the property was acquired." Patterson moved toward Dorothy with alarming speed. "That's restaurant property. I'll need to." "Don't you dare touch my daughter," Salai snapped, stepping between them. But Dorothy was already flipping through the pages with the careful reverence children show precious things. "There's writing in the margins," she announced. "Like Grandma's grocery lists, but different." Dr. Hawkins gently took the cookbook from Dorothy's hands, a historian's eye scanning the handwritten notes that filled the margins. Her expression changed from curiosity to excitement to something approaching awe. "Mrs. Hill," she said quietly, "these aren't grocery lists. These are records. Names, dates, property transactions." She looked up with eyes bright with discovery. "Your grandmother documented everything." Patterson lunged for the cookbook, but Judge Blackwood caught his arm with surprising strength for a man his age. "I think that belongs to Mrs. Burke's family," the judge said firmly. In the cookbook's margins, Ilsa Burke had hidden 30 years of evidence, a careful, patient record of every theft, every forged document, every corrupted official, every stolen dream. She had known, Salai realized with dawning amazement, that someday her family would need proof. The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of Dr. Hawkins turning pages and the distant clatter of dinner service in the main restaurant. Patterson stood frozen, watching decades of carefully buried crimes come to light in his own kitchen. Dorothy tugged on her mother's dress again. "Mama, there's something else." She pointed to a loose floorboard near the cookbook shelf, a board that was slightly raised, as if it had been recently disturbed. Salai knelt down and worked her fingers under the edge, lifting it to reveal a small metal box wrapped in plastic. Inside the box were documents, original deeds, real death certificates, photographs, and a letter addressed in Ilsa Burke's handwriting. "For my granddaughter Salai, when she's ready to finish what I started." The false resolution shattered completely. This wasn't just about one stolen restaurant or one corrupted businessman. This was about a systematic campaign of theft and erasure that had been documented by a woman who knew she was living on borrowed time. Patterson's phone rang, the sound sharp in the tense silence. He answered with shaking hands, his face growing paler with each word he heard. "Mrs. Hill," he said when the call ended, "I think we need to discuss a settlement." But Salai was reading her grandmother's letter, tears streaming down her face as she absorbed 30 years of love, rage, and carefully documented truth. "No," she said without looking up. "We don't need to discuss anything. We need to call to discuss anything. We need to call the FBI." The FBI field office in downtown Atlanta felt like stepping into a different world, one where institutional power could be wielded for justice instead of oppression. Special Agent Rivera had the kind of calm competence that comes from 20 years of investigating white-collar crime, and her partner, Agent Chen, specialized in civil rights violations with historical components. Mrs. Hill, Agent Rivera said as they sat in a sterile conference room 3 days after the kitchen discovery, "What you've brought us represents one of the most extensive cases of systematic property theft we've seen in decades." Salai clutched her grandmother's cookbook like a lifeline. The documents hidden in the kitchen floor had revealed a conspiracy that stretched far beyond one stolen restaurant. Dozens of black-owned properties across 3 counties, all acquired through similar methods over a 30-year period. Dr. Hawkins spread photocopies of documents across the conference table, her academic excitement barely contained. "The level of documentation is extraordinary. Your grandmother created an entire parallel record of property ownership, complete with photographs, witness statements, and financial records." "She was building a case," Agent Chen observed. "Question is, why didn't she ever file it?" Judge Blackwood, who had insisted on accompanying them to Atlanta, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Ilsa was cautious. She'd seen what happened to other people who challenged the system. "What do you mean?" Agent Rivera asked. The judge was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, something in his expression had changed, a weight that seemed to age him years and seconds. "There's something I need to tell you all. Something I should have said 3 days ago." He took a shaking breath. "Mrs. Hill, your grandmother didn't pursue her case because I advised her not to." The conference room went dead silent. Salai felt the world shifting beneath her again, but this time the movement felt like betrayal. "What do you mean you advised her not to?" Dr. Hawkins asked carefully. "In 1989, Ilsa came to me with evidence of what Patterson and his associates were doing. She had documentation, witnesses, everything needed for a federal case." Judge Blackwood's voice was barely above a whisper. "I told her that pursuing it would be dangerous, that she could lose everything, that she should take the money Patterson was offering and disappear quietly." Salai's hands went numb. "You told her to take money." "I thought I was protecting her," the judge said desperately. "The people involved in this conspiracy, they had connections everywhere. Police, courts, federal agencies. I genuinely believed that fighting would only get her killed." "But she didn't take the money," Agent Rivera observed. "No, she refused. Said she'd rather lose everything than validate theft." Judge Blackwood looked directly at Salai, his eyes filled with decades of guilt. "So they stole it anyway. And I let them." The revelation hit like a physical blow. The man who had positioned himself as their ally, their moral authority, their guide through this legal maze, he had been complicit in her grandmother's victimization from the very beginning. "You bastard," Harpo said quietly. "You've been playing us since day one." "No," Judge Blackwood protested. "When I saw you at the restaurant, when I realized who you were, I saw a chance to finally make things right. To honor Ilsa's memory by helping her family reclaim what was stolen. Or to control the narrative," Dr. Hawkins said, her historian's instincts recognizing manipulation when she saw it. "To make sure that if the truth came out, you'd be positioned as the helpful ally instead of the complicit bystander." Salai stared at the judge, feeling 30 years of family pain crystallizing into rage. "My grandmother lived in poverty for the last 20 years of her life. She worked cleaning houses and babysitting other people's children while you knew she owned valuable property. She died worried about medical bills while you sat on information that could have changed everything. Mrs. Hill, I understand you're angry." "Angry?" Salai's voice rose despite the federal setting. "My grandmother spent her final years believing she was a failure. Believing she'd lost everything she'd worked for. She never got to see Dorothy grow up in the restaurant she built. She never got to pass down the recipes and stories and pride that should have been her legacy. And you could have prevented all of that." Agent Rivera cleared her throat diplomatically. "Judge Blackwood, we'll need a complete statement about your knowledge of the 1989 events. But right now, let's focus on the current investigation." "Actually," Dr. Hawkins said, pulling out her tablet with an expression that suggested more bad news, "there's something else. I've been cross-referencing the property records with family genealogy databases, and I found something unusual." She turned the tablet toward Salai, showing a family tree that made no sense at first glance. According to these records, Timothy Patterson's grandfather was named James Patterson. He owned several properties in the county during the 1950s and 1960s, including the building that became Burke's Kitchen. So, Harpo asked, so James Patterson sold that building to Ilsa Burke in 1962 for significantly below market value. The sale was recorded as a gesture of community goodwill. Dr. Hawkins paused, her academic training warring with obvious discomfort. But there's more. James Patterson had a daughter named Catherine. Catherine Patterson Wilson. The name hit Salai like ice water. That's my mother's maiden name. Catherine Wilson. Mrs. Hill, Dr. Hawkins said gently. I think Timothy Patterson is your cousin. The conference room spun around Salai. Her mother had died when Dorothy was a baby, taking with her most of the family stories that might have explained connections and histories. But now, fragments of overheard conversations began making horrible sense. Her mother's reluctance to discuss the Wilson family, her grandmother's careful silence about certain topics, the way family gatherings always seemed to have missing pieces. That's impossible, she whispered. It gets worse, Dr. Hawkins continued reluctantly. According to the records, Catherine Wilson was supposed to inherit a portion of the properties James Patterson owned. But in 1962, she signed away her inheritance rights to facilitate her father's sale to Ilsa Burke. Agent Chen was taking notes rapidly. Are you saying that Mrs. Hill's mother voluntarily gave up property inheritance to help a black woman buy a restaurant in 1962? In rural Georgia, Agent Rivera added with obvious skepticism. Dr. Hawkins nodded. The documentation suggests that Catherine Wilson and Ilsa Burke were close friends. There are photographs of them together, letters discussing business plans, even joint bank account records. Salai felt like she was drowning in implications. Her mother and grandmother had been partners, not just vendor and customer. The restaurant hadn't been stolen from a stranger, it had been stolen from family. Mrs. Hill, Judge Blackwood said quietly, there's something else you need to know about why I really advised your grandmother not to fight. She looked at him with exhausted dread, unsure how many more revelations she could absorb. Timothy Patterson didn't just threaten Ilsa in 1989. He threatened your mother. And you. The words landed like blows. What? You were 16 years old. Your mother was a single parent working 2 jobs to keep you in school. Patterson made it clear that pursuing the restaurant case would result in your mother losing her employment, your family losing housing assistance, and you losing your college scholarship opportunities. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Her mother's sudden career changes in the late 1980s, the family's abrupt move to a different county, the way her grandmother had become distant and sad around that time. It hadn't been random life difficulties, it had been systematic persecution designed to force compliance. She chose us over the restaurant, Salai breathed. Both women did, Judge Blackwood confirmed. Ilsa and Catherine made the decision together. They sacrificed everything they'd built to protect you and give you a chance at a future. Harpo was staring at the family tree on Dr. Hawkins' tablet. Wait, if Timothy Patterson is Salai's cousin, and he knew about the family connection, then what happened at the restaurant wasn't random racism. It was personal. Agent Rivera leaned forward. What do you mean? He knew exactly who we were when we walked in, Harpo said, the pieces falling into place. The hostess refusing service, the whole production about not having reservations, it was theater. He was expecting us. Dr. Hawkins pulled up another document. Actually, that's not quite right. According to Patterson's phone records, he received a call 30 minutes before your arrival. Someone warned him you were coming. The betrayal cut deeper than anything that had come before. Someone close enough to know their dinner plans had deliberately set them up for humiliation. Who? Salai whispered. Dr. Hawkins scrolled through more records, her expression growing grimmer. The call came from a number registered to Blackwood Associates. Every eye in the room turned to Judge Blackwood, who seemed to shrink under their collective stare. Walter, Agent Rivera said quietly, please tell me you didn't orchestrate this entire situation. The elderly man's composure finally cracked completely. I thought if you experienced the humiliation directly, if you felt the injustice personally, you'd be motivated to pursue the case with everything you had. I thought I could guide the outcome, make sure justice was finally served. You used my family, Salai said, her voice deadly quiet. You used my daughter as bait to create a situation you could control. I was trying to fix 30 years of cowardice, Judge Blackwood protested. I was trying to give Ilsa the justice she deserved. No, Salai stood up, her grandmother's cookbook clutched against her chest. You were trying to absolve yourself of 30 years of guilt. And you were willing to traumatize a 7-year-old child to do it. The federal agents exchanged glances that suggested Judge Blackwood had just moved from witness to potential co-conspirator in their investigation. Dorothy, who had been coloring quietly in the corner with headphones on, looked up at the sound of raised voices. "Mama, are you okay?" The question cut through all the legal complexity and historical revelation and family betrayal to the simple truth. Her daughter had been used as a pawn in adult games she should never have been exposed to. "Agent Rivera," Salai said, "I want to withdraw from this investigation." "Mrs. Hill." "No. This isn't about justice anymore. This is about settling scores and absolving guilt and playing games with my family's lives." She gathered up her grandmother's documents with shaking hands. "My daughter has been through enough." "Salai, please," Dr. Hawkins said. "Think about what your grandmother wanted. Think about all the other families who could benefit from exposing this conspiracy. My grandmother wanted me to be safe and happy. She wanted Dorothy to grow up in a world where she belonged everywhere she went." Salai looked around the conference room at faces that represented everything she'd thought she could trust: federal authority, academic integrity, judicial wisdom. "This isn't that world. This is just another room full of people who want to use us for their own purposes." She picked up Dorothy and headed for the door, Harpo close behind her. "Mrs. Hill," Agent Rivera called after her, "if you walk away now, Patterson wins. Everything your grandmother documented, everything she sacrificed, it all dies with this case." Salai paused at the door, Dorothy's warm weight against her shoulder grounding her in what actually mattered. "My grandmother already won," she said without turning around. "She raised a family that survived. She passed down love instead of hate. She made sure her great-granddaughter knows she belongs wherever she chooses to be." And Patterson? The stolen property? The systematic theft from dozens of families? Salai finally turned back, meeting Agent Rivera's eyes with newfound clarity. "Agent Rivera, you have 30 years of documented evidence and federal jurisdiction. If you need a traumatized 7-year-old to make your case, then maybe the problem isn't the strength of the evidence." The door closed behind them with finality, leaving Judge Blackwood alone with the federal agents and the wreckage of his attempt at redemption. In the hallway, Dorothy looked up at her mother with serious eyes. "Mama, are we still fighting the bad men?" Salai hugged her daughter closer, feeling the weight of impossible choices and the unexpected lightness of walking away from other people's definitions of justice. "No, baby. We're going home." But even as she said it, Salai knew that home, whatever that meant now, would never be the same place they'd left behind. 3 weeks after walking out of the FBI field office, Salai sat in her car outside Dorothy's school, watching other parents pick up their children with the casual confidence of people whose worlds weren't falling apart. The termination notice from the bank lay crumpled on her passenger seat. Gross misconduct and violation of fiduciary responsibilities based on an anonymous tip about her family's tax irregularities. The house was next. Their landlord had delivered an eviction notice that morning, citing breach of lease terms and failure to disclose criminal investigations. Never mind that there were no criminal charges, no convictions, no evidence of wrongdoing beyond asking questions that powerful people preferred remain unasked. Her phone buzzed with another call from a debt collector. Since walking away from the federal case, their credit had been systematically destroyed. Late payment reports for bills they'd paid on time, fraudulent accounts opened in their names, mysterious charges that customer service representatives claimed they couldn't locate or correct. Patterson had kept his promise. Without federal protection, her family was completely vulnerable to the kind of financial warfare that destroyed lives quietly and efficiently. Dorothy emerged from the school building with her usual bright smile, but Salai could see the strain around her daughter's eyes. 7-year-olds weren't supposed to understand adult concepts like temporary financial difficulties, and we might need to stay with relatives for a while. But Dorothy was proving disturbingly perceptive about the tension that had settled over their household like fog. "Hi, Mama," Dorothy said, climbing into the backseat and fastening her seatbelt with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Rodriguez wants to talk to you about my art project." Salai's stomach clenched. Dorothy's teacher had been increasingly concerned about the family's situation since the restaurant incident became local gossip. There had been questions about Dorothy's emotional stability, suggestions about counseling, veiled inquiries about the home environment. "What about your art project, baby?" "I drew Grandma's restaurant for the heritage assignment. Mrs. Rodriguez says maybe I should draw something else instead." The casual erasure hit harder than any legal threat. They were trying to convince her daughter to forget her own family history, to collaborate in making Ilsa Burke invisible. "Dorothy, what do you want to draw?" "Grandma's restaurant," Dorothy said without hesitation. "I want everyone to know about the place where people came to eat together and plan how to make the world more fair." Salai met her daughter's eyes in the rearview mirror, seeing Ilsa Burke's determination reflected in the next generation. "Then that's what you should draw." They drove home in companionable silence, but Salai's mind was racing through impossible calculations. With no job and no savings, they had maybe 2 weeks before complete financial collapse. Harpo's construction work had mysteriously dried up, subcontractors suddenly discovering they were overstaffed or had budget constraints. The systematic destruction of their livelihood was thorough and almost elegant in its cruelty. Their small rental house sat at the end of a quiet street lined with modest homes and carefully tended gardens. It wasn't much, but it had been theirs, the first place Dorothy had her own room, the first place Salai had felt truly settled since childhood. Now the notice to quit sign on their front door announced their failure to the entire neighborhood. Harpo's truck was in the driveway, which meant another day without work. Salai found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by bills and legal documents, his usually steady hands shaking slightly as he tried to make sense of financial chaos that seemed to multiply hourly. "Any luck with the appeals?" she asked, though his expression had already given her the answer. "The bank says the termination is final. No appeal process for moral turpitude violations." Harpo's voice carried the exhaustion of a man who'd spent 3 weeks fighting phantoms. "The credit agencies say they are investigating, but investigations take 6 to 8 weeks minimum." 6 to 8 weeks, Salai repeated numbly. "We'll be homeless in 2. Dorothy had settled at the smaller table with her homework, but Salai could see her daughter's shoulders tense at the word homeless. 7-year-olds weren't supposed to worry about having a roof over their heads. "I called my sister in Birmingham," Harpo said quietly. "She says we can stay there temporarily, but—" He didn't need to finish. His sister's house was already crowded with her own 3 children, and the job market in Birmingham was just as vulnerable to Patterson's influence as anywhere else in the region. They'd be trading one form of instability for another, with no guarantee that the persecution wouldn't follow them. "What about Dr. Hawkins? Has she heard anything from the FBI?" Harpo's expression darkened. "Rivera called this morning. Without our testimony, they don't have enough for federal charges. The case is being transferred to state authorities." "State authorities?" Salai laughed bitterly. "In a state where Patterson has connections in every courthouse." The sound of a car pulling into their driveway made them both freeze. Through the window, Salai could see a white sedan with government plates, the kind of anonymous official vehicle that delivered bad news and court papers. The doorbell rang with the authority of bureaucracy. Salai opened it to find a woman in a business suit flanked by 2 others who had the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. "Mrs. Hill? I'm Janet Morrison from Child Protective Services. We've received reports of concerns regarding your daughter's welfare." The words hit like ice water. "What concerns? May we come in? I'd prefer to discuss this privately." There was no real choice. Refusing entry would only confirm whatever narrative had already been constructed about their family. Salai stepped aside, feeling their last sanctuary invaded by the machinery of official persecution. Dorothy looked up from her homework with the wide-eyed alertness children develop when adults start speaking in serious tones about things that might affect their security. "Dorothy," Morrison said with practiced kindness, "would you mind showing me your room? I'd love to see where you keep your toys and books." "I don't want to," Dorothy said simply. Morrison's smile never wavered, but something shifted in her posture. "Sweetheart, I'm here to make sure you're safe and happy. Sometimes talking to a grown-up who isn't your parents can help with that." "I'm safe and happy," Dorothy replied with devastating honesty. "Mama and Daddy take good care of me. We're just having money troubles because some people are being mean to us." Out of the mouths of babes. Morrison glanced at her companions, a social worker and what looked like a law enforcement officer, with an expression that suggested Dorothy's assessment was uncomfortably accurate. "Mrs. Hill, we've received reports about the family's financial instability, housing insecurity, and involvement in legal proceedings that may be affecting the child's emotional well-being." "Reports from whom?" Harpo asked, though they all knew the answer. "I'm not at liberty to disclose the source of the reports," Morrison replied smoothly. "But we take all concerns about child welfare seriously." The investigation was thorough and humiliating. They examined Dorothy's bedroom, reviewed her school records, questioned her about her daily routine and emotional state. Every aspect of their family life was scrutinized through the lens of suspicion, every sign of financial stress interpreted as potential neglect. Dorothy handled the interrogation with remarkable composure, answering questions honestly but without the fear Morrison was clearly hoping to uncover. When asked if she felt safe at home, Dorothy replied, "Yes, but I don't feel safe at school anymore because kids keep asking me questions about why their parents are talking about us." When asked about her emotional state, Dorothy said, "I'm sad that people are trying to hurt my family, but Mama and Daddy explained that sometimes grown-ups do mean things when they are scared of the truth." Morrison's final question cut to the heart of the persecution. "Dorothy, has anyone in your family asked you to lie about anything or keep secrets about adult conversations?" "No," Dorothy answered firmly. "But some grown-ups at school and other places keep asking me to forget about my great-grandma and the restaurant she built. They want me to lie by not talking about it." The interview concluded with Morrison delivering the news that would push their family over the edge. "Mrs. Hill, given the current instability in the household, we're recommending temporary placement for Dorothy while the family situation stabilizes." Temporary placement. The euphemism couldn't disguise what she was really saying. They wanted to take Dorothy away. "That's not happening," Salai said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "Mrs. Hill, I understand this is difficult, but we have to prioritize the child's welfare. The combination of housing insecurity, financial stress, and ongoing legal proceedings creates an environment that may not be in Dorothy's best interests." "Legal proceedings we're not even part of anymore," Harpo pointed out. "Nevertheless, the damage has been done. Dorothy needs stability, and frankly, your family doesn't appear capable of providing that in the immediate future." The moment stretched between them, filled with the weight of an impossible choice. Fight the placement order and risk losing Dorothy permanently in a legal system designed to favor institutional authority. Accept temporary separation and hope that compliance would eventually reunite their family. Dorothy, who had been listening with the intense focus children bring to conversations that will determine their fate, spoke into the silence. "I don't want to go away from Mama and Daddy." "Sweetheart," Morrison said with condescending gentleness, "sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do for our own good." "That's what the bad men always say," Dorothy replied with 7-year-old clarity. "They always say they are helping when they are really hurting." Morrison's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Mrs. Hill, you have 48 hours to make arrangements for voluntary placement, or we'll be forced to pursue emergency removal." After they left, the house felt like a crime scene. The three of them sat in their living room, surrounded by the debris of their former life, trying to process the reality that their family was about to be torn apart. "We could run," Harpo said quietly. "Pack tonight, drive to Canada, start over somewhere else." "And then what? Live as fugitives? Teach Dorothy that the only response to injustice is to run and hide." Salai shook her head. "That's not the legacy Grandma Ilsa would want." "What legacy?" Harpo's frustration finally boiled over. "Your grandmother's dead, the restaurant is gone, the federal case collapsed, and now they are taking our daughter. What exactly are we fighting for anymore?" The question hung between them like an accusation. What were they fighting for? Justice. That had proven to be a luxury they couldn't afford. Truth. That was sitting in filing cabinets somewhere while their daughter faced foster care. Family. That was about to be scattered by official decree. Dorothy climbed into Salai's lap with the weight of a child who understood more than she should. "Mama, if I have to go away for a little while, will you promise to keep fighting?" The request broke something fundamental in Salai's chest. Her 7-year-old daughter was asking permission to sacrifice herself for a principle. "Baby, you shouldn't have to. Promise me," Dorothy insisted with Ilsa Burke's determination shining in her eyes. "Grandma kept all those papers because she knew someday we'd need them. She didn't keep them so we could give up when things got hard." Salai held her daughter close, breathing in the scent of childhood innocence and inherited courage, and made a promise that felt like signing her own death warrant. "I promise." That night, after Dorothy had fallen asleep between them in the master bed, none of them wanting to be alone, Salai lay staring at the ceiling and contemplating the arithmetic of despair. No job, no home, no money, no allies, and soon no daughter. Patterson had calculated correctly. Without federal protection, they were completely defenseless against systematic destruction. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You still have 24 hours to reconsider. Drop the restaurant claims, publicly apologize for the false accusations, and your family situation will improve immediately. This is your last chance." The offer was salvation and surrender wrapped in the same package. All she had to do was betray her grandmother's memory, validate Patterson's theft, and teach Dorothy that some fights couldn't be won. In the darkness of their bedroom, surrounded by the quiet breathing of her family, Salai realized that winning and losing had become meaningless concepts. The only question left was what kind of example she wanted to leave for her daughter, and what kind of legacy she could live with herself. The calm before the storm felt like drowning in slow motion, with morning approaching like a deadline for the impossible choice between her principles and her family's survival. The morning of Dorothy's scheduled removal dawned gray and suffocating, as if the sky itself was mourning what was about to happen. Salai had spent the night alternating between frantic planning and numb acceptance, her mind cycling through increasingly desperate scenarios that all led to the same impossible conclusion. There was no way to save both her daughter and her principles. She found Harpo in the kitchen at 5 a.m., sitting at the table with papers spread before him and his phone in his hand. Something in his posture, the careful way he held his shoulders, the deliberate distance between them, made her stomach clench with new dread. "Harpo, what are you doing?" He looked up with eyes that had aged decades overnight. "I'm trying to save our family." "What do you mean?" Instead of answering, he handed her a legal document that made her blood run cold. It was a formal withdrawal of all claims related to Burke's Kitchen, complete with public apology language and acknowledgement that the Hill family had made unfounded allegations against Timothy Patterson and Magnolia Grove Restaurant. "You already signed it," she whispered, seeing his signature at the bottom of the page. "I signed it," he confirmed. "Morrison called an hour ago. The CPS case will be dropped immediately if we submit this by 9 a.m. Patterson's people have already arranged for the credit issues to be resolved and for me to start work on a major construction project next week." Salai stared at the document, feeling like she was watching her life dissolve in real time. "You made a deal behind my back." "I made a choice to protect my daughter," Harpo said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd been fighting a war he couldn't win. "Salai, they're going to take Dorothy today." "Not maybe. Not if we don't comply. They're coming for her at 10 a.m. regardless of what we do. This is the only way to stop it. By betraying everything Grandma Ilsa died for." "Your grandmother is dead," Harpo said with brutal honesty. "She can't help Dorothy. She can't pay our bills or find us a place to live or protect our child from being placed in foster care." He gestured to the withdrawal document. "This can." The words landed like physical blows. Salai understood, intellectually, that her husband was trying to save their family. But the betrayal cut deeper than Patterson's persecution, deeper than Judge Blackwood's manipulation, deeper than any external attack they'd faced. "You don't get to make this decision alone," she said quietly. "Someone had to make it," Harpo replied. "You were going to choose your principles over your daughter's safety. I'm choosing Dorothy over everything else. Including me." The question hung between them like a blade. Harpo's expression softened slightly, but his resolve didn't waver. "If I have to choose between honoring a dead woman's memory and protecting a living child, I choose the child every time." Dorothy appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her pajamas, her 7-year-old intuition picking up the tension radiating between her parents. "Are you fighting about me?" she asked with the direct clarity that children bring to adult complications. "No, baby." Salai knelt down to Dorothy's eye level. "We're discussing how to keep our family together. By telling lies about Grandma." Dorothy had clearly been listening longer than they'd realized. Harpo closed his eyes in frustration. "Dorothy, sometimes grown-ups have to make complicated decisions." "That's what all the bad grown-ups say," Dorothy interrupted with devastating accuracy. "They always say things are too complicated for kids to understand, but really they just don't want to explain why they are doing wrong things." The observation hit the kitchen like a thunderclap. Out of the mouths of babes came the moral clarity that adult desperation had obscured. Salai's phone rang. The caller ID showed Morrison's number. "Mrs. Hill, I'm calling to inform you that we've received some interesting documentation this morning. It appears your husband has been in contact with our office regarding voluntary compliance with our recommendations." "I'm aware of that." "Excellent. If you can confirm your agreement with the withdrawal document, we can resolve this matter without the trauma of forced removal." Salai looked at her husband, who was watching her with desperate hope, and at her daughter, who was studying both parents with the intense focus children bring to moments that will define their understanding of right and wrong. "Ms. Morrison, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." "Of course. If we sign this document, if we publicly apologize and withdraw all claims, How long before CPS finds another reason to investigate our family? There was a pause, just long enough to confirm what Salai already suspected. Mrs. Hill, I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm implying that this isn't really about Dorothy's welfare. This is about forcing compliance through threats to our child. And if we comply now, you'll know that threatening Dorothy is the way to control our family for the rest of her childhood. Another pause. Mrs. Hill, I strongly advise you to consider the document your husband has prepared. And I strongly advise you to go to hell. Salai hung up the phone and turned to face her family. Harpo looked like she'd just sentenced them all to death. Dorothy looked like she'd just witnessed her mother transform into a superhero. Salai, what have you done? Harpo whispered. I've decided that teaching our daughter to surrender to bullies isn't actually protecting her. They're going to take her. Then we'll fight to get her back. But we won't volunteer her as a sacrifice to make our lives easier. The sound of cars pulling into their driveway announced that the time for difficult decisions had passed. Through the window, Salai could see the white sedan flanked by a police cruiser. Morrison had come prepared for resistance. Dorothy walked to the window and looked out at the official vehicles, her small hands pressed against the glass. Mama, I'm scared. I know, baby. I'm scared too. But sometimes being brave means doing the right thing even when you're terrified. The doorbell rang with bureaucratic authority. Salai opened it to find Morrison flanked by 2 police officers and carrying paperwork that would legally authorize Dorothy's removal. Mrs. Hill, I'm disappointed that you've chosen to make this difficult. I have a court order for emergency placement of the minor child. On what grounds? Parental failure to provide a stable environment and refusal to cooperate with child welfare investigations. The circular logic was perfect in its cruelty. They were taking Dorothy because the family was unstable, and the family was unstable because they were threatening to take Dorothy. I want to see the judge who signed this order, Salai said. That's not how this works, Morrison replied. You can file appeals through the appropriate channels, but right now I need you to surrender the child. Dorothy stepped forward with the determined expression she'd inherited from her great-grandmother. I don't want to go with you, she said clearly. I want to stay with my Mima and Daddy. Sweetheart, I know this is scary, but we're going to take good care of you. That's what you said last time, Dorothy replied. But taking care of someone means listening to what they want, not just deciding for them. Morrison's patience was clearly running thin. Mrs. Hill, you can make this easy or difficult, but the outcome is the same. Please pack a bag for Dorothy. It was Judge Blackwood who had taught Salai that sometimes the law was a tool of oppression rather than justice. It was Dr. Hawkins who had shown her that truth could be buried but not destroyed. It was her grandmother who had demonstrated that some fights were worth losing if they preserved dignity and hope for the next generation. But it was Dorothy, 7 years old and facing the destruction of her family with more courage than most adults could muster, who finally showed Salai what real strength looked like. No, Salai said simply. Excuse me. No, you're not taking my daughter. Not today, not like this. Mrs. Hill, I have a court order. Then you'll need to explain to that court why you're destroying a stable, loving family to benefit the man who's been systematically persecuting us. Morrison's mask of professional concern slipped slightly. Mrs. Hill, you're making this much harder than it needs to be. Actually, said a new voice from the street, I think Mrs. Hill is making it exactly as hard as it should be. Everyone turned to see Dr. Hawkins approaching the house, but she wasn't alone. Behind her walked Agent Rivera and 3 other federal agents, all wearing expressions that suggested the cavalry had finally arrived. Dr. Hawkins. Salai couldn't hide her confusion. I thought you said the federal case was dead. I said it was transferred to state authorities. Dr. Hawkins replied with a smile that suggested she'd been holding back crucial information. I never said we'd given up. Agent Rivera stepped forward with her own set of official documents. Ms. Morrison, I'm afraid you'll need to suspend this removal order. This family is now under federal protection as material witnesses in an ongoing racketeering investigation. Morrison's composure cracked completely. That's impossible. We were told the federal case was closed. The case Timothy Patterson knows about is closed, Agent Rivera confirmed. The case he doesn't know about, the one involving 30 years of civil rights violations, systematic property theft, and conspiracy to defraud, that case is just getting started. Salai felt the ground shifting beneath her feet again, but this time the movement felt like salvation rather than betrayal. Dr. Hawkins, what's happening? What's happening? Dr. Hawkins said. is that your grandmother was even more thorough than we initially realized. And Agent Rivera is even more stubborn than Timothy Patterson calculated. The federal agents were already moving with practiced efficiency, photographing the CPS documentation and requesting copies of all court orders related to Dorothy's case. Morrison retreated toward her vehicles with the hasty efficiency of someone who'd suddenly realized she was on the wrong side of a much larger investigation. "This isn't over," she called back as she reached her car. "Actually," Agent Rivera replied, "it is. At least for you." As the CPS vehicles disappeared down their street, Salai found herself standing in her doorway with her arms around her daughter, watching her husband's expression shift from despair to confusion to something that might have been hope. "Salai," Harpo said quietly, "I'm sorry. You thought you were protecting our family," she finished. "And you were. Just like I was. We were just protecting it in different ways." Dorothy looked up at both her parents with the serious expression children wear when they are trying to understand complex adult emotions. "Are we still fighting the bad men?" "Yes, baby," Salai said, feeling her grandmother's strength flowing through her like a river finding its way back to the sea. "But now we're not fighting alone." The impossible choice had transformed into something else entirely. The recognition that some fights could only be won by people brave enough to lose everything in service of what was right. The federal courthouse in Atlanta buzzed with the kind of energy that accompanied cases destined to rewrite history. 6 months after the morning CPS had tried to take Dorothy, the Hill family sat in the front row of a packed courtroom, watching 30 years of buried crimes finally see daylight. Agent Rivera had not been exaggerating when she described the scope of the investigation. What had started as a simple case of restaurant theft had metastasized into a federal racketeering prosecution involving 14 defendants, 4 to 7 properties, and conspiracy charges dating back to 1987. "Dr. Hawkins," the federal prosecutor said as she took the witness stand, "please tell the court how you first became aware of the systematic property theft scheme." Dr. Hawkins settled into the witness chair with the composed authority of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment. "I was researching civil rights-era businesses for my book when I noticed a pattern of suspicious property transfers in rural Georgia counties. Black-owned businesses that had operated successfully for decades were suddenly declared abandoned or sold for unpaid taxes, always to the same network of buyers. And what made these transfers suspicious? The timing, the methodology, and the documentation. In every case, the original owners had supposedly died or disappeared right before their property was seized, but there were no death certificates, no missing person reports, no credible evidence that these people had actually gone anywhere. Patterson sat at the defense table looking smaller than Salai remembered, his expensive suit unable to disguise the reality that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling in real time. His lawyers had managed to delay the trial for months, but the evidence was overwhelming. "Dr. Hawkins, did your research reveal the scope of this scheme?" 4 to 7 properties across 3 counties, with an estimated value of over $200 million in current market terms. The scheme involved forged death certificates, fraudulent tax liens, corrupted county officials, and systematic intimidation of families who tried to challenge the thefts. Salai watched the jury's faces as the numbers sank in. $200 million stolen from black families over 30 years, all to feed a development scheme that had made Patterson and his associates wealthy beyond imagination. And how was Mrs. Ilsa Burke's case different from the others? Dr. Hawkins smiled with obvious admiration. Ilsa Burke documented everything. While other victims had their records destroyed or stolen, Mrs. Burke created a comprehensive parallel archive that she hid throughout her restaurant and her home. She knew that someday, someone would need proof. The prosecutor turned to a table covered with evidence boxes. "Dr. Hawkins, can you describe what investigators found using Mrs. Burke's documentation?" "Complete financial records showing Burke's Kitchen operated profitably until 1989. Photographs proving the restaurant remained active years after Mrs. Burke was supposedly dead. Witness statements from civil rights workers who met there throughout the 1980s. And most importantly, recordings." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. This was new information that hadn't been revealed during pretrial proceedings. "Recordings, Dr. Hawkins." Mrs. Burke had installed a recording system in her restaurant office after receiving threats. She documented conversations with Patterson, with county officials, with anyone involved in the scheme to steal her property. The recordings were hidden in a safe deposit box registered under her great-granddaughter's name. Salai's breath caught. Dorothy, 7-year-old Dorothy, had been the beneficiary of a safe deposit box she'd never known existed. Her grandmother had planned for this moment from the very beginning. Your Honor, the prosecutor continued, the prosecution would like to present evidence item 127. The courtroom fell silent as an old recording began to play. The sound quality was poor, but the voices were unmistakable. Patterson's younger self, discussing the Burke problem with someone identified as County Clerk James Morrison. She won't sell, and she won't be intimidated. Patterson's voice crackled through the speakers. We need a permanent solution. Permanent how? Morrison asked. Make her disappear on paper. File a death certificate. Declare the property abandoned. Sell it for taxes. By the time anyone figures out what happened, it'll be too late to reverse. What about her family? Her granddaughter? The girl's 16 and college-bound. Give her enough problems to keep her busy, and she'll never look back. People like that don't fight systems they can't understand. The recording continued for 23 minutes, laying out the entire conspiracy in Patterson's own words. When it ended, the courtroom was dead silent except for the sound of someone in the gallery quietly weeping. Patterson's lead attorney stood immediately. Your Honor, these recordings are 30 years old and of questionable authenticity. Your Honor, the prosecutor interrupted. We have 14 additional recordings, all verified by FBI audio forensics experts, all documenting various aspects of this conspiracy. Judge Patricia Williams, a federal judge from outside the region specifically assigned to ensure impartiality, had heard enough. The objection is overruled. The jury may consider the recordings as evidence. Agent Rivera took the stand next, her testimony revealing the investigation's scope with methodical precision. When we reopened the case, we discovered that the original FBI investigation in 1989 had been deliberately sabotaged. Key evidence had been misfiled, witness statements had disappeared, and the lead investigator had been transferred to Alaska in the middle of the investigation. Agent Rivera, what led you to suspect corruption within the original investigation? Judge Walter Blackwood. The revelation hit the courtroom like lightning. Every head turned toward the gallery where Judge Blackwood sat, his expression carefully neutral. Judge Blackwood came forward 6 months ago with information about his own involvement in the conspiracy. He had been blackmailed into compliance through threats to his family, but he had also been secretly documenting the corruption for 3 decades. Salai felt the world tilt again. Judge Blackwood's manipulation at the restaurant, leading them to the truth, forcing the confrontation, orchestrating the entire revelation. It hadn't been about absolving his guilt. It had been about finally finding the right moment to expose the truth. Agent Rivera, what did Judge Blackwood provide to the investigation? Complete records of every falsified document, every corrupted official, every threatened family. He had been gathering evidence since 1989, waiting for the right moment to bring down the entire conspiracy. The judge stood slowly in the gallery, his 78-year-old frame carrying the weight of decades of secrets. Your Honor, may I address the court? Judge Williams considered the request. Mr. Blackwood, you're not currently scheduled to testify. Your Honor, there's something the court needs to know about how this investigation really began. Proceed, but briefly. Judge Blackwood's voice carried clearly through the courtroom as he delivered the final revelation that would reframe everything they thought they understood. Your Honor, I didn't just happen to be at Magnolia Grove restaurant that night. I orchestrated the entire encounter because I knew that Mrs. Hill's daughter would recognize her great-grandmother's portrait. I had been watching the Hill family for years, waiting for the right moment when Dorothy was old enough to ask the right questions but young enough to ask them without fear. The pieces clicked into place with stunning clarity. The reservation that had mysteriously disappeared. The hostess who had been perfectly positioned to refuse service. The judge who had appeared at exactly the right moment with exactly the right knowledge. I manipulated that family into a confrontation because I knew it was the only way to force the truth into the open. Mrs. Burke had told me, years before she died, that someday her great-granddaughter would need to know the truth. She made me promise that when the time was right, I would make sure Dorothy learned her family's real history. Salai felt tears streaming down her face as 30 years of seemingly random events revealed themselves as carefully orchestrated justice. Her grandmother hadn't just documented the conspiracy, she had planned its destruction, using her own great-granddaughter's innocence as the catalyst that would bring everything into the light. Judge Blackwood, Judge Williams said carefully, are you saying that you manipulated federal witnesses? I'm saying I kept a promise to a dying woman who believed her family deserved better than the lies that had been built on her stolen legacy. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispered conversations as people processed the implications. Patterson's lawyers were frantically conferring, but their client looked defeated. The kind of beaten that comes from realizing you've been outplayed by someone you'd underestimated for decades. Dorothy, who had been culling quietly beside her mother throughout the proceedings, looked up with 7-year-old clarity. "Mama, does this mean we get Grandma's restaurant back?" The question cut through all the legal complexity to the heart of what mattered. Judge Williams smiled, the first genuine emotion she'd shown during the entire proceeding. "Young lady, I think that's exactly what this means." The prosecutor stood for her closing argument, but Salai barely heard the words. She was looking around the courtroom at faces that represented more than just legal proceedings. Dr. Hawkins, who had risked her career to uncover the truth. Agent Rivera, who had refused to let bureaucracy bury justice. Judge Blackwood, who had spent 30 years planning redemption. And Dorothy, whose innocent question had started an avalanche that buried 30 years of lies. When the jury returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, the courtroom exploded in applause. Patterson would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. His associates would face their own reckonings. The corrupted officials would lose their positions and their freedom. But more importantly, 4 to 7 properties would be returned to their rightful owners or their families. 4 to 7 stolen legacies would be restored. Hundreds of families would learn that their ancestors hadn't failed, they had been robbed. As they left the courthouse, Salai carried her grandmother's cookbook and the deed to Burke's Kitchen, now legally and officially belonging to the Hill family. Dorothy skipped beside her, chattering excitedly about plans for the restaurant and whether they could serve Grandma's biscuit recipe. "Mama," Dorothy said as they reached their car, "can we go see our restaurant now?" "Our restaurant," Salai repeated, the words feeling like magic on her tongue. "Yes, baby. We can go see our restaurant." But first, she wanted to stop at the cemetery where her grandmother was buried. There was a woman there who deserved to know that her great-granddaughter would grow up in a world where she belonged everywhere she chose, including in the restaurant her family had built with love, defended with courage, and reclaimed with truth. The victory wasn't just personal, it was generational, transformative, and completely inevitable once a 7-year-old girl decided to ask why her great-grandmother's picture was hanging on the wall of a place that claimed she didn't belong. Some fights, Salai realized, were won not by the people who started them, but by the children brave enough to finish them. 1 year later, Salai stood in the kitchen of Burke's Kitchen, no longer Magnolia Grove, watching her daughter roll out biscuit dough with the same careful precision her great-grandmother had once used. The morning light streaming through the windows felt different now, warmer somehow, as if the building itself was finally breathing freely after decades of holding its breath. The restaurant had reopened 6 months ago, but it wasn't the same establishment that had been stolen 30 years earlier. This was something new, a place that honored the past while embracing a future that Ilsa Burke could never have imagined. The walls now displayed photographs from both eras, images of civil rights workers planning strategy over coffee in the 1960s alongside pictures of diverse families sharing meals in the present day. "Mama, Mrs. Rodriguez's class is coming for the field trip tomorrow," Dorothy announced, her 7-year-old hands now 8-year-old hands confidently shaping dough into perfect circles. "I get to tell them about Grandma Ilsa and how she fed people who were working to make the world more fair." Salai smiled, remembering the terrified child who had pointed at a portrait and asked an innocent question that changed everything. Dorothy had grown in the past year, not just physically, but in her understanding of legacy and justice and the power of asking difficult questions. She wore her great-grandmother's dove necklace now, a symbol of the courage that passed from generation to generation. The morning rush was just beginning, and the dining room filled with the comfortable sounds of a thriving business. Burke's Kitchen served everyone, local families who had supported them throughout the legal battle, visitors who came seeking the authentic history they'd read about online, and former employees of Magnolia Grove who had been quietly rehired once the truth came out. Harpo emerged from the dining room, his tool belt replaced by an apron that read "Head of Everything Else." Dorothy's suggestion for his job title. The construction work had dried up permanently after their legal victory, but running a restaurant with his wife had proven surprisingly satisfying. Their marriage had survived the crisis stronger than before, tempered by the shared understanding that some fights required both compromise and principle. "Judge Blackwood's here," he announced, washing his hands at the prep sink. Table 6, reading the paper and waiting for his usual. The elderly judge had become a regular customer, arriving every Tuesday morning for coffee and Ilsa's famous biscuits. His federal testimony had resulted in a suspended sentence and community service, the court recognizing his 3 decades of evidence gathering as time already served. But his real punishment, Salai suspected, was living with the knowledge of how many years had been lost to fear and inaction. "I'll take his order," Dorothy volunteered, wiping flour from her hands and grabbing a small notepad with the serious efficiency of a child playing grown-up games. Salai watched through the service window as her daughter approached Judge Blackwood's table with the fearless confidence that had become her trademark. The old man's face lit up as Dorothy carefully wrote down his order, engaging him in conversation about school and books and whether he thought the biscuits were getting better or if she just thought so because she was the one making them. Dr. Hawkins occupied her usual corner booth, laptop open, working on the book that would tell the complete story of the Burke's Kitchen conspiracy. She'd taken a sabbatical from university teaching to focus on documenting not just Ilsa's story, but the stories of all 47 families whose properties had been restored. The book had already attracted interest from major publishers who recognized the commercial potential of a real-life David and Goliath story with a satisfying ending. The restaurant was more than just a business now. It was a symbol, a gathering place, a reminder that justice delayed wasn't always justice denied. Families drove hours to eat at the place where ordinary people had defeated a conspiracy 30 years in the making. Local schools brought students to learn about civil rights history that had happened in their own backyard. Graduate students came to interview Salai about the intersection of family legacy and social justice. But the most meaningful moments happened quietly, like when elderly black customers told Salai stories about eating at the original Burke's Kitchen during the civil rights era, or when young families thanked her for showing their children that fighting for what's right sometimes actually worked. The lunch rush brought its own rhythm. Orders called out, plates passed through the service window, the comfortable chaos of a thriving restaurant where everyone knew their role. Salai moved through it all with the easy confidence of someone who had found their true calling, but also with the deeper satisfaction of someone who had discovered that winning wasn't just about getting what you wanted, it was about becoming who you were meant to be. Around 2 o'clock, when the lunch crowd had thinned and Dorothy was absorbed in homework at the counter, a familiar white sedan pulled into the parking lot. Salai's stomach clenched instinctively, old trauma creating new anxiety, until she saw Dr. Hawkins wave cheerfully at the approaching figure. Agent Rivera entered the restaurant with a smile that suggested good news rather than new problems. She'd become an unofficial guardian angel to the Hill family, checking in periodically to ensure that Patterson's remaining associates weren't causing trouble and that the family was adapting well to their new circumstances. "Mrs. Hill," Rivera said, settling into a booth with the relaxed posture of someone off duty. "I come bearing gifts." She slid a legal document across the table, the final settlement check from the federal lawsuit. The amount was substantial enough to secure Dorothy's college education and fund the restaurant's expansion plans, but more importantly, it represented official acknowledgement that justice had been served. "There's something else," Rivera continued. "The Justice Department is creating a task force to investigate similar property theft schemes in other states. They've asked if you'd be willing to serve as a consultant, share your experience with other families who might be fighting similar battles." Salai looked around the restaurant that had cost her family so much and given them back even more. The idea of helping other families reclaim their stolen legacies felt like the next logical step in a journey that had started with a child's innocent question. "I'd be honored," she said simply. Dorothy looked up from her homework with the alertness that children develop when they sense important adult conversations. "Are we going to help other families get their restaurants back? Not just restaurants, baby. Farms, businesses, homes, any place that was stolen from families like ours." "Good," Dorothy said with 8-year-old determination. "Everybody should know where they come from." As the afternoon faded into evening, the restaurant settled into the quieter rhythm of dinner service. Regular customers arrived for the comfort food and the increasingly legendary biscuits, but also for the sense of being part of something larger than themselves, a community that had rallied around justice and discovered that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept no for an answer. Salai stepped outside as the last customer left, breathing in the evening air and looking up at the sign that read Burke's Kitchen, feeding body and soul since 1962. The neon had been restored to its original design, but new additions reflected the restaurant's expanded mission. Civil rights history tours available and community meeting space, all welcome. Dorothy joined her on the front steps, settling beside her mother with the comfortable familiarity of shared ritual. They often sat here in the evenings, watching the small town settle into night and talking about the day's events and tomorrow's possibilities. "Mama, do you think Grandma Ilsa knows what happened? Do you think she knows we got her restaurant back?" Salai wrapped her arm around her daughter, feeling the chain of connection that linked past to present to future. "I think she always knew, baby." I think that's why she saved all those papers and hid all those secrets. She knew that someday, someone in our family would be brave enough to ask the right questions. Like me asking why her picture was on the wall. Exactly like that. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the lights come on in the small downtown that had become home in ways Salai never expected. The legal victory had been satisfying, but the real triumph was this: the knowledge that Dorothy would grow up understanding her place in a long line of strong women who refused to be erased from history. Mama, when I grow up, will I run Burke's Kitchen? That's up to you, baby. You might want to be a doctor or a teacher or a lawyer or anything else you can imagine. The important thing is that you'll always know where you come from and what your family stands for. What do we stand for? Salai considered the question, thinking about her grandmother's courage, her own transformation from victim to victor, and her daughter's fearless willingness to speak truth to power. We stand for asking hard questions, fighting for what's right, and making sure everyone knows they belong wherever they choose to be. Dorothy nodded with the seriousness of a child absorbing important life lessons. That sounds like good things to stand for. The best things, Salai agreed. As they rose to go inside and close the restaurant for the night, Salai caught sight of something that made her heart skip. A young black family approaching the front door, the parents reading the historical marker that had been installed to commemorate the restaurant's civil rights legacy, the children pressing their faces against the window to peer at the photographs inside. "We're closed," Dorothy called out helpfully, "but we open at 6 a.m. for breakfast. The biscuits are really good." The family smiled and waved, the father taking pictures of the building while the mother read the historical marker aloud to their children. Another family learning their history, discovering that heroes weren't just people in textbooks but ordinary individuals who had decided that some things were worth fighting for. Inside the restaurant, Salai turned off the lights and set the alarm, but she paused at her grandmother's portrait. The same photograph that had started everything, now hanging in its rightful place of honor. Someone had left fresh flowers on the small shelf beneath it, and a note in childish handwriting that read, "Thank you for being brave." "Thank you," Salai whispered to the portrait, "for teaching us that the best way to honor the past is to refuse to repeat it." The drive home took them past the courthouse where justice had finally been served, past the elementary school where Dorothy was thriving, past all the familiar landmarks of a life rebuilt on the foundation of truth rather than lies. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The restaurant industry was unforgiving, the expansion plans would require careful management, and the consulting work with other families would demand emotional energy she wasn't sure she possessed. But tonight, Salai Hill fell asleep in her own home, next to her husband who had learned that supporting his family sometimes meant supporting their principles, listening to her daughter's peaceful breathing from the next room. She was no longer the woman who had walked into Magnolia Grove restaurant 2 years ago, hoping for nothing more than a quiet dinner and a normal life. She was Ilsa Burke's granddaughter, Dorothy's mother, and the owner of a restaurant that fed both body and soul. She was a woman who had discovered that the most important question anyone could ask was not "why me?" but "what now?" And she was living proof that sometimes, when brave children ask innocent questions about family photographs, they change the world. What did this story teach you about the power of family legacy and the courage it takes to fight for justice? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world.